Good evening. Good evening. It's so great to see so many of you here this evening for this incredibly important topic. We have our faculty meetings in this room, and it's never laid out quite like this. And so it's a shift in how I see the room, but it really makes a huge difference. So thank you for being here. So good evening. This is our first installment of what we're calling NYC 2025 Now. I'm Martha E. Stark. I use my middle initial because my mom also had the same middle initial of E. I am a clinical professor here at NYU Wagner since 2017 and have quite a few roots actually at NYU. I went here as an undergraduate and also went to the law school. Together with my co-director, who's not with here today, my colleague Thad Calabrese, we started an effort that we dubbed NYC 2025. NYC 2025 tried to convene nonpartisan experts across a range of areas so that we could have ongoing conversations about issues that must be addressed for the city to become a stronger and more equitable place. Certainly more so than it was before COVID-19, and given sort of more recent challenges, trying to figure out how we can be as equitable a city as possible. The first iteration of this conversation actually offered a series of policy proposals that explored issues centered around several priority areas: housing, taxes, healthcare, and of course, today's topic on public safety. NYC 2025 Now revisits these areas, and we're going to start with crime and safety. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to turn this over to Liz Glazer, and I was going to make a little joke that our dean, who is here, but she's on jury duty, so that's why she's not welcoming you. She calls her Lizzie. And so I still can't quite do that without laughing. But you all are here because you know Liz is amazing. She's the founder of Vital City, a policy journal that offers actionable strategies to build thriving cities. Vital City provides a broad range of creative and practical ideas for achieving and maintaining public safety. And their work is motivated, and this is why I actually love the journal. And anytime Lizzie calls me and says, do you want to write something, including telling me what you did during the last blackout, I just jump at the opportunity to do it because their work is motivated by a love for New York City. And I share that love for New York City, a belief in the power of evidence and optimism about the future of cities. Before that, of course, many of you know, Liz served as the director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. She oversaw the criminal justice agencies in New York State as the governor's deputy secretary for public safety. She's a former federal prosecutor. We're not going to hold that against, no, just kidding. And she clerked for then U.S. Circuit Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That's really an amazing sort of accomplishment. I do want to note, though, along with Steve Cohen, a founding member of Blue Raven LLP, they suggested that we convene this panel, and Steve is doing sort of the kind of silent, he's around, he's but the silent partner here. Steve, want to sort of thank you for that convening. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Liz. Thanks.
So Martha, you can always call me Lizzie. Okay. It's only for the cognoscenti though. So thank you so much. In the history of crime and what we should do about it, I'm going to let you in on a secret. I don't think anyone has ever run to the barricade saying, turn on the lights. The response when crime goes up is to send in the cops. And this is actually very, very strange. Because what we know, not kind of sort of what we know, but what we know at a random controlled trial level of knowing is that lighting dark places reduces serious crime by 36. Oh, interesting. Hold this. All right. Oh, it's on. So the usual response to crime is to send in the cops. But there are all kinds of other things that we know to a high degree of certainty reduce crime as well. Lighting is one of them. Random controlled trials, not just in any old city, but in this city, in the housing developments in this city, showed that lighting dark places reduces serious crime by 36%. And that's not some outlier finding. There's other evidence also from this very city also, and in random controlled trials showing that summer youth employment programs not just reduce crime, but reduce mortality of the people who are in them. And we know that teaching people different ways to think about how to react in situations. This is work from Chicago Crime Lab, Ready, Mean a Man, also reduces violent crime. And there's something that all of these examples have in common. They're about strengthening our ties between one another, what are called informal social controls. And it's really sort of 90% of what makes us safe. And it's the reason why we stop at a light at 2 in the morning, even if there's not a cop there, because there are these connections and expectations that in the main are what keep us safe. And of course, police have an effect. There are a ton of studies on that. And deploying police is easy in some ways. They're paramilitary for the most part. You say turn left or right, and they will do that. They're in every neighborhood. They're there 24/7, but it also has costs. It's not just dollar costs, so that's not insignificant. In New York City, there are 37,000 people on the police force at a cost of $11 billion. There's also a cost in trust between police and New Yorkers. And it's a connection that's taken a bunch of hard knocks in recent years, particularly in communities of color. And just to give you sort of a quick example of what that means, because those words often just sort of float off into kind of bromides. The erosion of trust was particularly evident in the overuse of stop and frisk. So in 2010, almost 700,000 stops were made, focused almost entirely on young Black men and almost entirely in just a few neighborhoods. So it essentially meant that you couldn't run to the store for a quart of milk without a high expectation that you would be stopped by the police. And when people don't trust the police, they don't report crimes. Cops can't solve crimes without cooperation. That further undermines neighborhoods' confidence in what police can do. It further depresses interest in reporting crimes. And so there's sort of this vicious cycle. And obviously, those are all things to work on. But it's not an academic question to try to figure out how to use not just the 10% solution, policing, when there's another 90% that we could deploy in lighting, summer youth employment, all these other things that we know about, and that would have a sustained and durable effect without some of the harms that have come from over-policing. And the recent pandemic-related violence wave that I know this panel will talk about makes this issue of what tools do we use a really urgent question. So we had 3 years of the lowest crime and incarceration rates in the city ever between 2017 and 2019. And I see some of my colleagues who made that possible during that period. And then In the pandemic, shootings exploded. They doubled. And they stayed that way for 2 years. They've begun to come down. They're still 25% above where they were pre-pandemic. And so we need to be able to think about how we deploy every effective strategy that can reduce the violence. And it needs to be organized and integrated. And because of the mix of not just police, but all these civic services, it likely needs to be owned not by the police alone, but by a high-ranking civic leader, perhaps a deputy mayor, who has the authority and knowledge to be able to make the right mix across the board. So we have an incredible group tonight led by our own Martha Stark. They will have all the answers to all the questions. So Martha has deep and broad experience in city government, including as a commissioner of finance. And she really, and I've worked with Martha for many years in government and outside. And she knows better than anyone what it takes to take a policy idea from an idea through the wilds and thickets of internal city politics and external politics. So Martha, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Liz. And so I'm just going to say to my fellow panelists here, you actually have to try to eat the mic so that folks can hear. So sort of think of it as an ice cream cone that you're not going to actually lick because that would be gross. However, just you really, so I think folks who were pointing to me and saying you wanted Liz to eat the mic a little bit more than she did, I'm just going to encourage my panelists, eat the mic. It's all good. So let me just sort of say thank you, Liz. So what does it actually take to move this world where safety depends on a mix of police and other civic services? What does it take to actually translate ideas into action? Who needs to be persuaded and how? Is it elected officials? Is it government leaders, budget directors? Is it commissioners, the public, others? How do we get to the point where people are running to the barricades, as Liz said, shouting, "Turn on the lights"? That is what needs to happen. Well, we could not have a better group of people to try and figure this out with tonight. We're going to start with Marcos Soler, who is the state's Deputy Secretary of Public Safety. He oversees 9 state agencies, including prisons, state police, Homeland Security, and others. Before that, he was the director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, advising the mayor on criminal justice policy. He knows the world of crime and justice better than anyone, as well as what the currents are that push one policy to the fore over another. Eric Cumberbatch just reminded me that we met at a time when he was at NYCHA. I actually grew up in NYCHA housing. He's at the center for policing equity, and before that, he actually ran the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety. In addition to building, fielding, and supporting the nation's largest network of violence interrupters, Eric created and deployed a whole series of other strategies to reduce gun violence. He worked every single day with both community groups and with police and other government players to figure out how these multiple strategies could force action. Anna Harvey, I'm pleased to tell you, is a professor of politics, affiliated professor of data science and law. She's the director of the Public Safety Lab here at NYU School of Arts and Sciences, where I graduated. So that's really pretty cool. She is also the president of the Social Science Research Council. In each of her roles, she has been a powerful voice for how evidence and science can improve the quality of our lives. She's written about the evidence behind civic goods as a way not just to reduce crime, but to improve neighborhood life and the trajectory of individual life course. Actually, at the SSRC, she has actually put money behind the idea of how to take ideas and make them live in a world at scale. So thank you to the three of you for being here. And at this juncture, I'm going to turn it over to Marcos, who's going to give us a little bit of an overview with some data. So he's going to start us off, and then he'll come back sort of later. So we'll go from Marcos. Then we're going to actually have Anna say a word or two, Eric, and then go back to Marcos. So it's on you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me well. So very briefly, you're going to see a number of slides. Imagine that you're 30,000 feet above and trying to come down to the individual level. That's what we're going to do. I'm going to try to take you on that trip. So the first slide is about the world. And basically, this is the global view. We have something exceptional happening in 2020 and 2021, which is everybody talk about the pandemic as the driver of crime. And certainly the pandemic had a lot of elements that brought a lot of disruption to our life. But in reality, gun violence and lethal violence only exploded in one part of the big planet, and that is the United States. You can see how nothing changed in Europe, nothing changed in Asia, nothing really changed in other parts of the world. And then obviously we go, into the United States version of the world. I look at the 50 states, and all but 2 states have increases during this period of time. I selected the top 12 states, among other things, because New York is among the largest states, so easy to compare apples to apples. So as you can see here, clearly New York is at the bottom, the big red one, and everybody else saw increases. We saw increases generally about 35% nationwide, about 60% in the state of New York. Obviously, wanted to also give you the historical perspective in this journey. As you can see there, this is the reality since the 1950s to 2022 and 23. Some people will tell you that we went back to the 90s. The reality is nothing here suggests that New York City went back to the 90s. No, even 2001 or 2000. But however, that was not necessarily the case for the United States, with murder rates much more similar to the 1996-97. Something changed certainly also in New York State. Now we went from the state level, from the national level to the state level. You can quickly see there the situation both in New York City and outside New York City, New York State in the middle. As you can see there are all the parts of the state experiencing increases in lethal violence, in murders during this period of time, whether that was in New York City or whether you were in Buffalo or in other parts. More specifically, I focus on 20 jurisdictions that are normally connected to the greatest elements of violence: Buffalo, Rochester, Albany, other big similar cities, not as large as our, but certainly large cities in the state. And you can see there that we both have the similar pattern. But one striking thing is, as quick as it came, it seems to be coming down. Right now, and we will talk more about that, right now you can see murders outside New York City. It's basically back to the 2017, 2018 level. In New York City, it's about 2012. In terms of shootings outside New York City, we are in 2017, 2018 levels. In the city, we are already in 2016 levels, which historically will make the 4th best year in terms of shootings. Not necessarily the picture that you probably read on the papers or watch on the news. I want to take you now to the local level, right? At the end of the day, the city is a city of boroughs in one way. We'll go into the neighborhood in 1 second. But you can see also that there are significant disparities within the city. It's not the same thing if you live in the Bronx, where people probably experience violence, crime very different, and gun crime, than if you live, for instance, in Queens. You see, again, the violence is 4 times greater in the Bronx. And you can see this spike during the pandemic as well. I'll take you now to the neighborhood level. I selected the top 15 neighborhoods with the most violence over the last, since 1993 to 2023, and compared to the bottom neighborhoods, another 15 neighborhoods with the lowest level of violence. And this is what you have. What you have is certainly a very, very low levels of violence in places like the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side, and some parts of Manhattan, Greenwich, and some parts of the outer boroughs, and then high level of concentration and persistent violence over years in places like East New York, Brownsville, etc. So it's time to think about, and it's not just about shootings. We saw the same thing, by the way, quickly on all gun crimes. Certainly, it was not just about a shooting. It was also about a robbery with a gun. It was about an assault with a gun, whether or not resulting in ultimately in a shooting, including some rapes with guns, etc., which went also up. Let's go to the individual level. This is consistent across the United States. Violence affected primarily Black young men. Not as young, to be clear, is from the age, a really elevated levels of violence going up to 44 years old, etc. So certainly disproportionate impact across the United States in that particular group, certainly males more than females. And also on the structural level, because in order to do a shooting, you need a gun. I wanted to show here one thing that I find to be interesting, which is that you can see that the supply of guns really matters. New York as a whole has a supply of guns, about 14% of households have guns. And you can see a firearm mortality of about 5.3 according to the CDC in 2022, compared, for instance, to Mississippi, 54% of households have firearms, a mortality of about close to 30 per 100,000. So all that is a major factor as well. And the final thing I would say is a lot of people confuse these two terms, gun violence, crime. There are two undistinct things. Gun violence went up, certainly during the pandemic. Now it's starting to go down. You can see then the dynamic is certainly different, both nationally and in New York. You can see nationally, crime is actually down, historically, and also down compared to just a decade ago. Similar in New York, with one big difference. Outside New York City, you have similar levels to crime, the same crimes than you have in 2017, 2018 for all forms of crime, what is called index crime. In New York City, however, crimes have exploded, and you are in 2006 levels, and certainly 50% more than we had during the pandemic. This is basically what happened and where we are right now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Marcos, for that background. Why don't I turn it over next to Anna?
Sure. So here we go. Is that on? Hello? Yeah. Hello, hello. Oh, there we go. Okay, I'm on. So one of the things that that Liz asked, and thank you, by the way, for having me. One of the things that Liz asked me to do was to talk about interventions that reduce violent crime, including gun crime, that don't involve the police. And actually, the first thing that I want to do is just push back on that a little bit. I find that an odd dichotomy in terms of thinking about interventions that work. And I guess what I think we should be thinking about is interventions that work, right? Sort of the interventions that provide us net social benefit, right? And there are some kinds of interventions that are police-based, police-led, that I do think provide us net social benefit. There are plenty of others that involve civilians or not people at all. But I think that's, you know, I don't think the framing should be police versus non-police, right? Let's think of what provides us the, you know, the largest social value for the buck. The second thing that I want to say about that is that those kinds of interventions that provide the largest net social benefit tend to involve deterrence, right? So preventing crime from happening in the first place. Anything that involves post-crime, so that's, you know, that's an arrest, it's prosecution, it's sentencing, it's incarceration. All of those things tend to have very large collateral costs for defendants, where in a lot of those cases, and I've done some of that work myself, defendants end up having higher rates of reoffending, having experienced the enforcement action relative to defendants that didn't. And so what we really want to do is we want to prevent the crime from happening in the first place. And that's deterrence. The third thing that I want to say about that is that there are the different kinds of interventions we have. I know Liz wanted us to talk about implementation challenges. Some kinds of intervention are people-based, right? They involve people delivering services of some kind to other people, to the city, whether those services are police or they're social workers or they're teachers or they're doctors. And people-based interventions tend to be very expensive. And with oftentimes increasing costs over time and increasing costs as we scale. There's other kinds of interventions I'd characterize as maybe infrastructure, where with a one-time fixed upfront investment in a place or a situation, I'll explain what I mean in a minute, we then are done paying the cost and we get benefits for the life of the intervention. And so those, I think we need maybe to think more about infrastructure investments that create deterrence, which provide us with net social value. And I think we tend to think of those things not that often. So infrastructure things. Oh, and I guess the final thing I should say is that when we're talking about deterrence, we're talking about affecting decision-making, right? So we need things that affect an individual's decision to commit a crime. That's the margin on which we're trying to push here. So infrastructure investments that tend to affect decision-making. So some of them are, so Liz mentioned like one of our favorites, like it's lighting, right? And it's pretty low cost, right? You light areas, you're increasing the probability of detection and you're affecting decision-making. Another one that maybe people like a little bit less, but it tends to have a similar effect is surveillance cameras. So you install surveillance cameras, right? You're increasing the probability of detection, you're reducing the probability of crime. Things that are a little more expensive are things like turning lots into parks, right? And we think that that's also largely increasing probability of detection because you're getting more people out into the lots that used to be vacant, derelict lots, and now they're parks. You're increasing eyes on the street. Rehabbing vacant buildings. So there's an RCT going on right now in Philadelphia on taking vacant buildings and rehabbing the front so that they're more presentable. And again, that's designed to draw more people out onto the street. And then infrastructure things that are more expensive, but have been shown to have really large benefits. And so at the end of the day, it's just a question of whether the benefits are larger than the cost. Eliminating lead from our environments, whether that's pipes or it's paint or it's anything like that, air pollution. And then finally, housing, providing more housing. So those are all things that have been shown to reduce crime, and they're infrastructure investments that if we can do them, we can reduce crime. The people-based interventions that affect probability of detection are all about getting more people out on the street, but now we're paying people, right? We're hiring people to go out. So that can be civilians. So there's this great program in Chicago called Safe Streets that put civilians out on the streets, particularly during the hours of the day when kids were walking back and forth to school, just to have more eyes. And I think police are probably the number one kind of person that we pay to be out there deterring. And, as mentioned, there's a bunch of actual experiments, quasi-experiments, putting visible police patrols on the streets deters crime on those streets. So, the more that you pay to have police officers patrolling streets, that does not mean that taking enforcement actions is also net cost benefit, right? It's having the deterrent effect of the visible police patrols is what seems to get us the most bang for the buck. And then people-based interventions to improve decision-making that aren't infrastructure. These are things like substance abuse treatment programs. Those work, mental health, behavioral health treatment programs. Liz mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy, that works. And some are jobs as, it's hard to know whether that's an infrastructure or a people-based, but it takes people to run it and you have to have people to hire the kids. And so it's a little more people-based than infrastructure, but it seems to work too. So those are things that all work to reduce violent crime. We know that for whatever New York City is doing, we have one of the lowest rates. It has gone up, but we have one of the lowest rates of violent crime, homicide in particular in the country. If you look at where cities are right now, New York City is about hovering around 5 homicides per 100,000 people, but we have cities, Detroit, Baltimore, New Orleans, where it's, 40, 50 homicides per 100,000 people. So, so it's also an important perspective to keep in mind.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Eric?
Thank you. And thank you for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all tonight. Before I jump into this conversation, I really want to just level set and really get factual and grounded in reality, so to speak. Really quickly, how many people live in the South Bronx in this room? We just saw a graph and charts that showed neighborhoods in New York City. South Bronx being very high in shootings. How many people live in East New York in this room? One person. Out of all the neighborhoods that we're speaking about, one person is the representation that we have to talk about issues, solutions, policies, practices, alternatives. We have one person who represents that space. I want us to be grounded in the fact that people are not inherently criminal. And we have to lead with that fact and that understanding. And that the neighborhoods that we speak about did not become neighborhoods in disarray. Accident. And we have to accept the fact that there is a design that still carries out today and still plays out in its practices. And it may not play out in its practices because people want to be white supremacists or people want to be racist. But we have institutions that have policies, practices, and procedures that still carry on a legacy of white supremacy in Black and brown communities and still look at and target and charge Black individuals, Black men in particular, as threats to society. And that doesn't just play out in law enforcement spaces. That plays out across all government institutions. And that also shapes and shifts the culture on how we interact with each other as well, and how we look at individuals as being criminal, less than, or what have you, who's privileged, who's not. The same graphs that Marcos, and Marcos is my guy, so this is not, he just happened to pull graphs up. If Martha would have pulled graphs up, I would say, Martha, your graphs are great. I actually want the PowerPoint, but I also want to level set a bit. The same graphs that Marcus showed us, if you were to lay health indicators on top of that graph, it will have the same pattern. So when we talk about responses for the types of things that we're seeing, then we should be talking about public health in the same context. We should be talking about how do we educate people? How do we create economic mobility? How do we create stable housing, stable families? All of those things, which we know, it may not be causation, but are directly correlated to the issues that we care about. But we're talking about one institution, policing and safety, as if that's the sole fix. And there's multiple layers and institutions that we have to engage that really drive what the public safety space is and or is not. Opened up with framing the NYPD's budget at $10 billion. Where else are we dedicating $10 billion to make communities safe in New York City? And how is that being shared across a connected infrastructure to tackle some of these long-standing pressing issues? But we always come back to one institution, our law enforcement agencies. If we're talking about police as a deterrent, we are way too late. We are way too late. We have to think upstream, and we really need to be in a position of empowering communities, empowering families, reckoning with this country's past, being truth tellers in the space, and letting that guide how we lead. And then we end up leading with love. And when we lead with love, then we see what our responses become. Spent some time in Montgomery. Spent some time in Memphis. This is recent. I have my Just Mercy shirt. Because how do we change systems to move away from punishment and move towards healing? And that's what we need more of in this space. So I don't want us to believe that policing or law enforcement agencies or any CJ actors own public safety. And for us in this space, it's to democratize public safety and make public safety about everything else beyond policing. So much so that there isn't a need for police. There isn't a need. And that's the space that we have to drive towards. Now the space on how do we bring policing in the right ways to create public safety. I don't think we need to live in a world where we have to think, I need to have an omnipresent force watching me so I won't do something out of human character, as if I'm not capable, I'm not able. But I challenge everyone, are you capable and able to envision a world without and build that world? And that's the work that I'm doing. I don't know if I have more time, but I could. Okay. I really just want to focus on, practices that go beyond the traditional. How can we breathe into existence with our imaginations? And we're stuck right now. And we've been doing these same things. It's over-policing, it's incarceration, it's harsh prosecution. And that's how America has tried to solve its toughest issues. We have to go beyond that. And that's the space that we're in. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Eric. Want to close us out, at least this part, just with 3 or so more minutes that you said, or 4 minutes with your thoughts, Marcos. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So I'll make 3 basic points. What I think is legitimate to have debate and a possibility. So the first is where I come from and what I have learned from the data, from the analysis, and from talking to a lot of the folks who are experts in this area, is that there is much that we can do certainly on the prevention that we are not doing. So when you develop an state budget, when you develop a city budget, there are now a lot of opportunities, and I think we have done that over the years, and certainly in the most recent budgets with the governor, we're addressing some of the structural issues which I think are important. It is important to invest, for instance, in summer youth employment programs. Why? Because they work. They actually work, and they have a very positive impact in reducing youth involvement in the criminal justice system, reducing fatalities, etc. It's important to also involve in community organizations that have a strong presence in the community in order to prevent acts of violence. We saw that in New York City. We saw some of the statistical analysis that indicated that in the neighborhoods where the police and the violence interrupters were working together was much safer than the neighbors that did not have that presence together. I see it also at the state level, where I see the jurisdictions where we are investing in both police working together with those community groups, we see much better results and reductions in violence than in other communities. That said, is important. We think we can do much more, for instance, in alternatives to incarceration and a bunch of reentry work and all these tested initiatives that have been done. The second thing that I also know is I don't think people are inherently criminal. You are completely sure. I agree with you on that. However, the reality is one and simple, right? There is the unfortunate reality that 85% of the people in any given year in New York City in the last decade who have committed a murder or have been involved in a shooting had an experience with the criminal justice system. That doesn't mean necessarily that the response should be a punitive response. But the question is, why is then we are not providing a particular response, since these people are folks that we know, are known to the system? What are our possibilities for intervention points before we get to the point in which somebody's going to get into a shooting or somebody's going to shoot somebody? That's my main concern. Prior to the shooting, what are our possibilities for interventions? And I think that's an area where we don't see a lot of work, but certainly we could do more, because certainly we know, as I said, somebody doesn't get up in the morning and says, oh, I'm going to shoot today somebody. That is not how it works. That's not how it works in the system. And the third thing is with regards to the criminal justice system services as a whole. It's true that in the long term, you cannot rely only in the criminal justice system, but there are moments, periods of time where you need to cool off the temperature of the system, where the lack of any kind of system just creates a dynamic that is counterproductive. I'm going to give you a very concrete example. For the last 8-10 years, I was monitoring every week the number of arrests for both gun possession, unlawful gun possession, as well as for murders. I can tell you that the period of time where the gun violence started in New York City in May 10 of 2020, from that period of time for the next 2 months, there was basically no enforcement. There was basically no prosecution of any kind. There were no courts operating and moving these cases. That created a whole dynamic of retaliation, essential shootings, etc., that in itself has a very powerful effect in the community. And so sometimes, in order to cool things off, you have to figure out what is the appropriate response. And the appropriate response is not necessarily militarizing the place, but rather developing newer strategies, primarily around intelligence, that can change the game. One of the things that I am the most proud of is in the last 2 years, we have created a network of crime analysis centers in the state, unlike any other network in the entire country. So to me, when I look as to why we are back in 2018 at the site New York City, it's not random. It's not just because things happen, because there are many other jurisdictions where things are not going down in that direction. It's because you invest in very targeted strategies that work. And why do you invest in intelligence? Because at the end of the day, you can solve certain crimes, you can solve certain shootings and murders, and potentially prevent the next round of retaliation. That's why I think we can all figure out a way, as we were saying here, to make this work together without necessarily saying police, no police, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. So here's what we're going to do next. I'm going to actually get the panelists to talk with each other and maybe sort of say, given what each of you have said, give you an opportunity to ask one or both panelists a question. I want you to sort of, kind of respond, if you will, Anna, to what Eric and Marco said with a question of your own, and then Eric, have you do something similar, okay?
Well, thank you. Well, so I was listening to Eric and thinking how we're using different language, but at the end of the day, we're saying almost the same thing with maybe one exception. I think that the thing we're almost saying the same is the importance of investing in the infrastructure, right? That's the communities are, depend on these long-term investments in housing and the availability of behavioral health treatment, and schools and parks and people out on the streets with their kids and their dogs, right? That these are all important things that keep a neighborhood safe. We need to make, I think if we made more of those investments, those would be hugely cost effective, right? Because we would make them and then they would continue to provide benefits, for years and years to come. While we are waiting for those investments to pay off, there are also shorter term things we can do, like the lights or the cameras. Those would be easy to install. Like we can do that, in a year. I don't know why we haven't done it. I mean, where Liz is to explain to us why, what are the mechanisms that explain why we haven't done those sorts of things yet. But I think, in the interim, I guess my question for Eric is, would you agree that maybe a compromise position between the two of us is that maybe there's a role for deterrent police action, not enforcement police action like stop and frisk, arrests for misdemeanor offenses that don't have victims and that just lead to collateral consequences for defendants, but a benevolent patrol position that we can scale back as infrastructure investments start to pay off.
Thank you. So my response there is that there definitely is a role for police. And I will say I'm not an abolitionist, as much as many people would love for me to say I'm an abolitionist. I'm not. But I think the roles that we rely on, we as a society relies on, for police to undertake have nothing to do with policing or need for police. We have law enforcement officers show up for a mental health crisis. We have law enforcement in schools. We have law enforcement and CJ actors across the nation governing what's happening in your bedroom. I mean, we have to draw a line on how far and how deep do we need to rely on that institution. And I think there's other institutions that could be brought to fuller scale that can easily tackle and handle those quality of life issues, those social service issues, those public health issues. And it should not be, because of the over concentration of policing in Black and brown community, that for any crisis at hand, someone with a gun and a taser is showing up. That is dangerous. That is inherently dangerous, and it's wrong. And then the rhetoric that you get is, well, now we've shifted away from that. We're doing neighborhood policing, and you get to know your police officer. How many people in this room would tell their children, their grandchildren, or someone else that you should know the police officer outside? That notion is ridiculous, that I have to know you so that you won't do what to me? I go to the hospital, I expect the doctor to help me. I don't have to know the doctor in the ER. I put trash out on front of my house. I don't have to know the sanitation worker so he will pick up the trash and not throw it at me or not throw me in the truck. But this is what we're talking about. We're talking about a system that we rely on that is the most punitive system for all of the issues that have nothing to do with policing. So the scale of how and when police are deployed is where I'm at. So it's not an anti, but it's more so what is the right dose, so to speak.
Thank you. So I just wonder, it seems to me, Anna, that you sort of said, I think Eric and I are kind of saying the same thing in terms of infrastructure. And so I think, Eric, you talked a lot about some infrastructure things, but you also talked about attitudinal things. So, both the idea that Marcos sort of agreed with, people aren't inherently criminal, but also this sort of idea of thinking about neighborhoods in disarray and what has cause that? And so would we add a new category, right? So to Anna, your sort of their people-based things. I think Eric's saying there's some attitudinal things that also need to change. Is that a fair description of how you're thinking about this, Eric?
Absolutely. There's a culture that exists, and there's an undercurrent of that culture. And there's also a comfort around what segment of the population is suffering. And there's a comfort there. And when that segment doesn't necessarily reflect the power structure, you're left out. You're left out. And you know, as we were speaking here, I imagine a world where, you know, we didn't need a civil rights act to say I should exist. Imagine a world where there wasn't redlining, which created the East New York and the South Bronx. Imagine a world that didn't have these structural problems that still exist. And the culture is, whether or not people want to admit that this is what they outwardly express, but your actions show that you believe it. Your actions show that you believe that someone is less than, and or someone, I'm comfortable with that population being treated as such.
Do you have a question? Well, actually, why don't we do this? Because you all have been wonderful, sitting and listening and taking in what's been said here. Why don't we go to the audience for a little bit and see what, if any, questions you might have for the panelists? And your hand went right up really quickly. So yeah, that's the hand. Good. Kenneth, thank you, by the way. Thank you.
Hi there. So as has been discussed repeatedly, the New York Police Department employs 37,000 people. They've got a budget of $11 billion. And as also been mentioned, we know how to do a lot of the non-police stuff that prevents crime from occurring, that prevents lethal violence and violence in general. So my question to you all, to what extent do you guys think that the reason we're not doing this 90% of other things that could help is down to a lack of technical knowledge, I guess, among the people in a position to implement? Or to what extent is it an interest group dynamic where there are people who don't want to do something other than policing because they might lose out on that?
Just one thing about, the size of the budget and the number of police. Just remember, New York City is a really big city, right? And so the number of police per capita in New York is not, is about the same as it is in, I was just looking these up today because I was curious about it. Less than in Chicago per capita, about the same as in Baltimore, less than in DC. A little bit more than in Detroit, but it's kind of in line with where these other big cities are. So now that doesn't mean that you don't still have a good point about why aren't we investing in all the other things, particularly the things that are kind of low cost, like the lights. But I do think it's New York City is not out of line in terms of the size of its per capita police force.
So I would just add the historical root of policing in America is around slave patrols and ensuring that you have laws on the books like trespassing, vagrancy, noise complaint, all of these things where you can easily target individuals and bring them back to the plantation. And that's what happened with policing, and it grew. I don't know if much has changed from that cultural mentality. And there's a population that people do not want around them and don't feel comfortable with that population being near them. And there's a tension there. And until we're able to have that type of reckoning with ourselves and with the institutions that are supposed to serve, we will always be in this contentious space of trying to unpack and undo. I do these all over the country. It's the same conversation. It's the same conversation. It's deeper in the South though, but it's the same conversation that we're having tonight.
But we can't ignore this side.
Yes or no? Okay, I appreciate the distinguished panel and the various perspectives. I would like to focus at this time on something a little more quotidian that unfortunately none of us are able to avoid, which is the lack of safe streets and sidewalks, the bike problem. This touches on a number of things that panelists have said. First of all, there has been no enforcement. There was no effort to establish a responsible bike culture 23 years ago when Bloomberg came into office. So just to get to the point, how do we deal with this? I'm sure that the cops, because I was involved working with the Ninth Precinct, that they would have really relished helping by enforcement establish a responsible bike culture, but they were held off by the higher ups at the behest of transportation alternatives. So we are left with a mess. How do we go about doing this in a compassionate, rational way?
I'll turn to Marcos, you know. At the state level, I'm sure he something.
When I do think, you know, your question's slightly off topic, but I do think it's related in that it's about how do we make sure that a feeling of safety, however you think about safety, and certainly walking and, you know, the bike culture and the motorbike culture is connected to that. So I think it's kind of trying to think through what's the right way of dealing with what feels like a state of disarray in that arena. Did you want to say something, Anna?
Oh, I was just unclear if the concern was about the bikes hitting people or the people on the bikes getting hit. Oh.
Getting hit, maimed, and just
By cars.
now, I will say, because the focus has been on fatality on some level. 18 people have been killed by these e-bikes.
Oh,
So,
e-bikes.
you know,
Yeah.
take that tidbit and chew on it.
Gotcha. I mean, I will just say that I think this is it's interesting. I think because there are both infrastructure and enforcement, and, you know, certainly there's been a lot of activity to build the dedicated bike lanes intended to protect us from cars, but the e-bikes, right, are going to, I don't know if that was even anticipated at the time, you know, when those were getting built. Yeah, that's an interesting question.
And there's why don't we go here and then come to you? Yeah, sir.
So we have one police department, but we have 5 district attorneys. They have different ethnicities, different life experiences, different professional skills. And as a result, you know, notwithstanding the laws, the criminal laws on the books, they have 5 different approaches to the implementation of the prosecutorial side of criminal justice. How can we develop a uniform approach to, you know, the justice system when we have different, you know, with all the well-meaning in the world, different philosophies as to what that actually means?
I'm actually going to take this one because I've worked with district attorneys' offices in a bunch of different cities, and it's actually there's a lot more variation than even that, because it's the assistant district attorneys who are, you know, showing up to handle every given case, and there's a lot of variation across the ADAs in terms of how they approach cases. And we've actually been trying to use that variation to start to try to learn about what are the most effective prosecutorial policies. I think it's not at all clear that we know. Right. And it raises this question of what is a prosecutor supposed to do when they approach a criminal case, right? Are they supposed to try to get a conviction if the evidence supports, even if they think that getting the conviction in that case might actually reduce public safety? right? Because you're increasing the probability that that defendant reoffends, because now that defendant who had a clean record, has a criminal record, has diminished employment prospects, right? Or is the prosecutor supposed to take into account, right? Okay, well, what's going to be the consequence of my action on future? Like, it's not clear to us what prosecutors are actually thinking when they approach these cases. We're starting to try to understand some of the downstream impacts. Although all we've really gotten so far are for the non-violent misdemeanors, which do make up most cases in most offices. When you've got a first-time defendant coming in, they don't have a criminal record, that taking that case to prosecution is net bad. Because now you're setting that defendant on a path. Things that involve violent crime, felonies, those we're still trying to understand, and those are harder because we get less randomness in the assignment of ADAs to cases. But it's just to kind of and I'm not sure that we are ready for a uniform prosecution policy yet, because I don't think we know yet what the best policy is.
Marcus.
Is that in the last 2 decades, we have seen an incredible amount of polarization to the extent that there are a lot of partisan positions and believe that it's difficult to get together around common values and common ideas, and difficult to put together, for instance, a budget where substantial segments of the population and the voting population will be in favor. I push against that. I think it's possible to get that common agenda. It's possible to look at a budget, whether when I was in the city or whether now in the state, which is comprehensive and addresses many different value perspectives. But I think it's also very important to bring institutions like this into the debate. I think part of why we have the politicization that we see in this area, in this field, is because a little bit academia has taken a step away. I'm not saying that they are not studying all the important things and you are not studying important things, but some folks are not really studying these issues to the level that allow to find common grounds where people cannot dispute certain basic findings. Let's give you an example, right? Everybody should have access to a similar kind of neighborhood where there are lights, where things look good, normal, and things don't look dysfunctional. Doesn't matter whether you live in Brownsville or whether you live in the Upper East Side. That should be a common goal. That reduces crime in both places. So why are we having a debate about it, right? We need more academic work and partnerships that actually transforms the public debate. And that is always what I try to do, is to figure out what is going on out there, what the academics can tell us about how we can bring down the temperature, the political temperature, and find that common ground that 60, 70, 80% of people will agree to.
Can I just say that on behalf of the academics in the room, like, we have those studies. Like, we have the studies on, lighting and parks and garbage and, building facades, and we've done the RCTs and we've done the equality. So I think it's something, about how do you actually get policymakers to take up the evidence? Actually, people are now starting to study that systematically and scientifically, which I think is interesting, right? And so maybe we in the research community haven't thought about that step, not doing the studies, but communicating them effectively in ways that will have impact.
You had a question.
So fascinating conversation. I'd like to go a little deeper and say, can y'all talk a little bit about how do we grapple with the correlation between crime, safety, the perception of safety, and how it's correlated with policing? And maybe to contextualize it a little bit, we could talk. Let's talk about transit, right? We are experiencing the safest data-wise that the transit system has been in the last 3 decades. Yet people say that they don't feel safe moving in our transit system. And what makes them feel safer is seeing police at the station and hearing announcements that there are police at their station if you need. So I love where you were heading, but I'm grappling this idea, this ethos that even hearing that announcement makes people feel like they could ride transit more. And how do we grapple with what the data says and that sentiment that people feel?
Yeah, I think there's a polarized narrative. And right now, my narrative necessarily isn't the most popular narrative. And what I'm delivering isn't what you're gonna hear when you turn on the news or those types of things, which feed people. And I think what is fed to people is fear mongering. And it's only going to heighten as we move into this election year. And it's going to be, look what's happening in democratic cities, crime is out of control, that type of narrative, and it will continue. So your subway sort of framing, I think that is going to happen for all of the 7 majors when it comes to this year. But controlling the narrative is key. So when we're in spaces, are we able to articulate truth? Are we able to be truth tellers? As Marcos pointed out, really speaking with data, you can't argue scientific fact. So if I could show you numbers and give it to you in a way that you actually understand it, most people, if I was to pull up those charts in someone's community, they'd say, well, I'm looking at a bunch of squiggly lines. But if I can articulate it in a way where people understand what is actually happening and I speak their language, then that changes how I feel, because now I know I'm actually better informed. So I think it's controlling the narrative. And right now, the folks who control the narrative want you to be afraid.
So we're running a little low on time, but I'm gonna use my executive prerogative here to go a little bit longer. There's one thing I want to ask the panelists. I do not want us to leave without, from each of you, one thing. And I know this may sound naive and it may sound a little too ambitious or not ambitious enough. If there were one thing that you thought the city of New York, and I'm going to stay in the city just because we're here, could do to address the issues that you described, what would that one thing be? What should we have on our agenda?
I'm happy to go first. I mean, I think there's such good evidence about both the short term and potentially the long term payoffs to investing in these place-based strategies that the neighborhoods that have the highest violent crime right now should look the same as this neighborhood, right? Physically, as much as we can. And that means, the facades are repaired and the garbage is picked up and there's no, the vacant lots are parks and, there's trees, and these things are not actually that expensive, right? And so let's just do it. Let's just invest in those neighborhoods.
If there was one thing for me, I would just say to lead with love. And if we operate from a lens of love, I think it changes all of our policy ideas, our own philosophical beliefs about people, how we treat each other, and how we see each other in the space. And if we operate from a lens of love, I think we get to a safer city.
Can I just push back? What does that look like? Like, what does that look like to try to sort of implement? Is it language? And so tell me what you think that looks like.
I think it's in action. So, the action will generate the language and so forth. But are we making love actionable? So is that shown in how I show up? Is that shown in my care and compassion? Is that shown? So if we talk about interactions with government, if we talk about how people are treated in spaces, is it from a lens of love?
So I'm trying to be clear about this, since I'm not in a position to give advice to the city of New York. So I'm giving advice to what I would do if I were in my old role more than anything else. I would say what I have found interesting at the state level in my last 2 years is that the investments that we have made to improve investigations, to improve the data sharing, the analysis sharing, the intelligence collection, have made a significant difference in, and I think it explains why the levels of violence in the state, outside New York City, are better than are right now in the state. I think there is a need to, yes, invest in all these things that we need to invest in communities, etc. But it's also a very strong need to invest in intelligence, very targeted approach to policing, and is going to make us safer.
Thank you. Just in closing, actually, I wanted to give Anna Harvey a chance to actually just talk a little about what the Social Science Research Council is doing in this regard.
Yeah, thank you. So there are 2 slides. Yep. So we're going to see one. So the first is I just wanted to publicize an opportunity that we have thanks to Arnold Ventures. We've been one of the things you find in the research, not just in criminal justice more generally, but since we're talking about criminal justice, is that the kind of work that has the most impact is work that is done, research that is done in cooperation with implementing partners, whether it's cities or it's firms or it's nonprofits. That kind of work takes a lot of time. And young early career researchers aren't generally given that kind of time. So these are 3-year postdocs at a generous salary, and they're unrestricted as to what you do and where you live. And it's really intended to give people the time and the autonomy to innovate. So I just wanted to publicize those. Please publicize them to your students. The second thing is that on the question of moving from research to impact, we've raised funds and we're trying to figure out what to do with them, where we're trying to help people in the research community think more seriously about what kind of work do I need to do and what are the steps that I need to take in order to get something that looks like a solution in the petri dish in order to get that taken to scale. And so I think what we're going to do is launch something like an incubator where researchers from across the country can apply. You know, we've got a pilot or we've got an idea or we think it's potentially scalable, and they can get seed funding and coaching and guidance to take it to the next level. So if anybody has ideas about how to do that in this kind of context, please find me, and I'd love to talk. So thanks for giving me the time to pitch those.
So I think we're gonna close, but move into an area where you can continue the conversation with beverages and some snacks and the like. But let me just take a moment to just thank each of the panelists for their perspective, for their time, their energy, and all of their kind of incredible work in this arena. I don't think that any of us could say that this topic is not important. It's really important to each and every one of us, and the work that they're doing is really laudable. And thank you for spending your time with us. Greatly appreciate it. And just because I'm here, my dean stayed the whole time, even though she's juror number 5 on a case in Manhattan Criminal Court. I just wanted to just give you an opportunity to say hello and goodbye to people.
I really want to thank our panelists, and especially Martha, for stepping in and being the moderator, but and also Steve and Lizzie, who brought this idea to us. And it's just wonderful to be able to have this kind of conversation about critical issues in the city. And I appreciate you all coming, and I'm glad Wagner has the opportunity to host.
Thank you. Liz, how you feeling? Steve, you guys good? Happy? Great. Let's move on. Let's go get something to eat. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your time.